Hey everyone, welcome back. We are gonna talk about Flexbox versus Grid and which one you should use and when. Now there has been, and still is, a lot of chatter on the subject. Some people say that you should always use Flexbox, others swear that CSS Grid is the best thing ever. People take this versus thing a little bit too seriously. I mean, both CSS Grid and Flexbox are great tools. And nobody is gonna spank you if you use both. Right? So in this tutorial I'm gonna give you my opinion on what each one of these is better suited for and when you should use them. Flexbox is a one-dimensional model, while CSS Grid is a two-dimensional model. And from the math classes, we all know that 2 is bigger than 1, and therefore is better. Being one-dimensional, Flexbox will lay out the flex items in one direction, the one of the main axis. So you have to decide whether you want a row-based or a column-based layout. You can't really have both. Grid layout, on the other hand, is a true two-dimensional model. Because it lets you work on both the horizontal and the vertical axes. And you can use these to precisely place grid items into cells defined by rows and columns. I'm in CodePen, and I'm gonna start with a div class container inside. I'm gonna create basically 3 cells, 1, 2, 3. Now, when it comes to the CSS, I'm gonna target the container and I'm gonna add some padding. This is purely for visual styling. And I'm gonna do the same thing for the cell, add a background color and the padding as well. Just so we can see these cells a little bit better. Now let's build this layout with Grid. So I'm gonna create a class of Grid. And I'm actually gonna add it to my container like so. And inside, I'm gonna set the display to Grid. And I'm gonna say Grid, template columns, 1fr 1fr 1fr, and let's also add a grid gap of 1 rem, right? So that's your layout. We have 3 equal columns, and you can easily do this with Flexbox. This is the typical example of what you would use Flexbox for. But the thing is, it's much easier to deal with Grid because I can now change the size of this middle cell to take up twice as much space as the other columns. I can even make it take 3 times as much space as the other columns, right? So it's super simple with Grid and the syntax is very elegant. If we were to do this with Flexbox, we would do the following. Let's create a Flex class. We'll set the display to Flex. And let's also use the gap property for Flexbox, 1rm. And let's change the class here from Grid to Flex. So now we're getting our 3 columns, but they are not taking up as much space as we want. We can easily do that by saying Flex, and we'll target the cells. And we can set the FlexGrow property to 1. That means each flex item will take up as much space as possible. And because we have 3 cells or 3 flex items, they're gonna take up equal amounts of space. If we want this middle one to take up twice as much space as the other, so just like we did with Grid, we can do that as well. We can say flex cell, and we can target nthchild too. So the second flex item. And we can say FlexGrow, too. And it's gonna give us the exact same effect. Now, this is the amount of code that we wrote for Flexbox to achieve this layout. And this is the amount of code that we wrote with Grid. Stay connected and subscribe to the channel for more interesting videos.